Russia is a very large country, and while it is easy in our minds to simplify it to Moscow and St. Petersburg, there is a wealth of diversity as you move east. But there is also a diversity of wealth, and that has some interesting implications for how the war has unfolded so far. So, if you can afford this phone call, please pick up, because it is time for the Geopolitics Helpline. How does inequality affect war? I am curious about this as a general question. Inequalities create grievances, but also specifically regarding the Russia-Ukraine war. We hear a bunch about Russia's poorer regions, but we do not often get a clear explanation for how that affects negotiations and political strategy. Well, let's see what we can do today. For the general part of your question, I suspect that the answer you were seeking is ultimately going to be unfulfilling. There have been a large number of studies that look at inequality and war. The results, though, tend to be all over the place. Your initial logic would likely be that inequality creates grievances between the lower classes and the upper classes. As a result, there ought to be more conflict in countries with high degrees of inequality. We might also observe wars across borders where poorer countries take out their frustrations on richer countries. Indeed, it is not hard to find individual studies that show that relationship. However, if you look at the wider domain of studies that use inequality as a predictor, you will often find that there is no statistically distinguishable effect. Why? Think about the argument that I just laid out. When there is inequality, two parties have a substantive disagreement with one another. But what does that tell us about the prevalence of war between them? If you are watching this channel, then you have received your fill of crisis bargaining theory over the last 4 years. And you likely know that the answer is that grievances do not tell us much. There are grievances about almost everything, almost everywhere around the world, and inside of each country. What differentiates areas where there is war from areas where there is peace is the presence of a bargaining friction. Sure, it makes first-order sense for inequality to be a driver of war, but everyone is aware that war is costly, and if there is an opportunity for the lower class to fight against the upper class profitably, the upper class would be better off making a concession to satisfy the lower class short of war. As a more general point, I feel bad for anyone who studies international relations security policy with quantitative methods, because this problem is so commonly the case. A perfectly reasonable sounding argument just gets subsumed by crisis bargaining. Any effect that we ought to observe in the data ends up getting muddled. Note that I am not saying that inequality is irrelevant for the subject. I am just saying that I would not design a society to be so unequal that it leads to war. Nonetheless, conditional on wars occurring, inequality does shape the way that they are fought. Seeing as the title of this video is How Inequality Fuels the Russian War Machine, we ought to keep our focus there. You likely know the basics of Russian societal inequalities. On one level, you have the standard Russian oligarchy problem, where exceptionally wealthy elites conspire with the political elites to control both the economic and political systems in the country. Then there is regional inequality inside of Russia. Moscow, St. Petersburg, and a handful of other large cities dominate the vast majority of economic opportunities in the country. As you travel further east into Siberia and Central Asia, you basically have large stretches of poverty mixed in with exceptionally valuable energy deposits. The story of post-Soviet Russia is dominated by these far-flung groups languishing without economic opportunity. Moreover, because they have no political power, there have been few attempts at reforms to change that. Fast forward to approximately 2023, when the Kremlin concluded that the best way to staff the Russian army was to look out east. As ever, they remain politically unimportant. But it is the financial aspect that matters here. The Kremlin hardly cares whether a Russian from Moscow or a Russian from Siberia dons an army uniform. The Kremlin just wants men with guns on the battlefield in Ukraine. Thus, what matters for raising an army is how expensive it is to provide a competitive wage for the hundreds of thousands or millions of men that you need to recruit. And now you might recognize why inequality matters here so much. Prior to the war, the average monthly salary inside of Russia was about $600. If there were no inequality inside of Russia, then to sign a would-be soldier to a contract, all you would need to do is offer that $600 plus a sizable risk premium. But Russia, just like any other country, is not free from inequality. In practice, you need not base your contract salary on the average monthly wage. You can shade it down substantially, only needing to come up from the bottom until you get the number of individuals that you seek. Well, with all of the poor people far out in the East, you could offer what is, by Western standards, a poverty wage and still have a large number of volunteers. They fully understand the risk put in front of them, but they are willing to incur the risk because they may receive the equivalent of years and years of salary for a stint over in Ukraine. And even in the worst-case scenarios, where they lose a limb or their life, there may still be enough money for their family to survive and even do better than they were before. This is the only reason why Russia has been able to fight the war in the manner that it has. As a point of comparison, you would never see a war like this in the modern-day United States. The moment that the White House asks Americans to sign up to ship out to a similar situation, you would have a whole bunch of people laughing back in your face. The only way to get this to work is to raise salaries. But because the United States does not have a large pocket of exceptionally impoverished people, the contracts necessary would be so large that it would render the enterprise infeasible. Now, per the earlier conversation from this video, none of this means that the war would not happen in the absence of Russian inequality. Rather, it would merely shape what the conflict looks like and perhaps alter the bargaining incentives in unpredictable ways. As a further point of comparison, the United States is still perfectly capable of fighting wars, but the shape of the war looks entirely different. The United States did not, for example, invade Iran because the number of soldiers necessary for that and the risk of casualties was so high that the economics behind it would be politically unviable. Once more, we are shaping expected outcomes, but not necessarily altering whether wars occur. I have one final thought here, and this is something that we have discussed before. Individuals with lower natural incomes and who are recruited for military purposes tend to be less ideologically motivated. This is far from the ideal situation for the Kremlin. You would prefer that all of your recruited soldiers are self-starters, motivated to extend the Russian realm. You might actually think that such ideology is negatively correlated with income levels inside of Russia, precisely because everyone out east has little buy-in to the federal government. The problem is that if you put out a fixed wage for recruitment, you cannot access the more ideologically inclined individuals without signing up all of the poor and disinterested individuals. This is far more problematic for militant groups, where there is less oversight of foot soldiers. In contrast, the Russian army can resolve this problem to some degree by having more officers oversee what their outranked men do. However, there are limits to this thanks to the drone-infested battlefield, as infantry may be left alone for long periods of time. That can have drawbacks from the command's perspective, like those individuals trying to surrender at the first possible moment. In sum, inequality has significant consequences for the conduct of a war. Nonetheless, the many consequences of war all ultimately get wrapped up into an expected outcome and anticipated costs of fighting. Thus, if I were working for a country's intelligence service, I would want to know a great deal about my opponent's inequality problems and the sentiments in the country about it. But as an outside observer and social scientist, it has surprisingly little effect on whether we observe conflicts or not. Meanwhile, there is plenty of inequality in terms of viewership on some of the geopolitics helpline videos. Why don't you go check out the archive and see which of the unloved ones you might personally love? And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.